services this morning. Dan is on his way back. I know that because he texted me at 4:45 this morning just to make sure that I had his class covered today. He had several people assigned to cover for his classes, and I think some dates got messed up on one of them and created some unwanted attention. So this morning so you had a sub last week too in this class, right? And I don't know who the sub was. I don't even know what the topic was either. What did you guys talk about last week? Gary Dodd, okay. And what did you talk about? Okay, so there's a good chance I'm not going to talk about the same thing. It occurred to me that I was gone last week. I was in Dallas last week, and it occurred to me I may want to find out what the sub last week spoke on so I don't speak on the same thing. But that's not going to be the case, I don't think. What I want to talk about is a topic that I'm just sure that I have benefited more about studying for this than I'll be able to present in the time that we have today. Because it's something that I personally, need to spend some time on and work on. And so hopefully what has helped me by studying it will also help you, if that makes sense. And I think it will. Have you noticed there's an election coming up? Has anybody... It would be hard to ignore the fact that there's an election coming up. Many of you, like me with our work, end up having some interest in what's going on politically and geopolitically. With my work, I deal primarily with North America, but I also deal with South America, Asia, and Europe. And when it's about to be election time in North America, they say elections don't really affect the economy. Well, that's not true. I'm sorry, because so many of the decisions that happen after that have large effects. And with my line of work, I'm usually interested in what's going on in construction and ag primarily, but also material handling, road building, things like this. And of course, those things get impacted by elections. And the other area, is things like trade and tariffs. That has a big effect on what happens in my line of work too. So unfortunately, there's a part of me that whether I want to or not, I have to be somewhat engaged politically. But the problem for me is not so much that I have to do that, is that I have always been somewhat engaged politically in terms of kind of understanding what's going on. And the problem is if that becomes too much of a priority. So that's what I want to talk about this morning, is just as a refresher for myself, as well as for you, what are our responsibilities as Christians towards our government? It's a common study, but I hope in the midst of an election season, this might help keep our perspective. It kind of goes very well with what Brett talked about this morning. And that is kind of the mission drift or mission creep. That's a real danger. And I would say maybe you can relate to this, but in the election season, they spend billions of dollars advertising to us, don't they? I mean, you can't avoid it. So they want to grab some of your mind, right? In order to secure a vote or get you thinking a particular way. So what does the Bible have to say with it? Well, the message is actually quite simple. And in reality, if you look at the Bible from cover to cover, there is all kinds of practical tips and guidelines on how to deal with this issue that we can glean from it. So I will not even come close to doing this justice this morning. But I do think just kind of the formative statements come from, I think, three primary sources in the New Testament. So if you're taking notes and you want to study this topic further, the three texts we'll probably look at least today are Romans chapter 13, 1 Peter chapter 2, and 1 Timothy chapter 2. Those are probably the ones that I'll spend the most time in, but we'll make reference to all kinds of things in our Bibles. So I'm going to set some ground rules. Politics can get pretty exciting and heated. What's off limits this morning? We're not going to talk about any candidates or any political parties. So how are we going to do this then, Tim? Well, believe me, we cannot talk about any candidates or political parties and have this conversation. The beauty of Christianity is that it works regardless of what happens to the government. And that's what we're really going to discover by having this conversation. So let's look at Romans 13. I'm going to read the first 7 verses, and then we're going to make some points out of Romans 13, and then it'll probably lead us to those other 2 areas that I mentioned. So, again, this is quite simple, but I think it's something I need to hear, you need to hear. Romans 13, and I need to pause here. I almost forgot to do this. Let's talk about Romans for just a moment. There is so much to be gained from Romans, and particularly between Acts and Romans in our New Testament, there's a lot to be gained on this topic, because we see the early church interacting with the local government of its day. And so there's a lot of interplay and things that we can glean from it. But Romans in particular has some very relevant themes to today. What was happening in Rome for the Christians was you kind of had 2 factions of Christians, those who came out of Judaism and those that were Gentiles who came to Christ through that. And so a lot of the things addressed in Romans has to do with some of those challenges within the church to be unified because of those 2 backgrounds. But at the same time, they're trying to address that under what's happening in Rome with the leaders there and the government that they're having to deal with. So it's kind of very, very similar to the day. And, we think that, what really gets us thinking about this topic more and more is we have seen a decline in our country in terms of morality. A lot of people will say, and I think this is probably a very true statement in a lot of ways, that we're a post-Christian nation. When you look at what comes out in our society and what is no longer reproofed, unanimously in our culture, you can see why that's a true statement. Well, it certainly wasn't a Christian nation, the Roman government either, at that time. So the message in that day would be just as pertinent as it is today. And so there's just really 2 main things in Romans 13 that we need to keep in mind. I love it when it's easy, when you only have to remember 2 things. And then there's kind of a third tangential one that I think we need to keep in mind as well. So Romans 13, let every person be in subjection to the government authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. Therefore, he who resists authority has opposed the ordinances of God, and they that have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what is good, and you will have the praise from the same. For it is a minister of God to you for good, but if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing. For it is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath upon one who practices evil. Wherefore, it is necessary to be in subjection not only because of wrath, but also for conscience sake. For because of this, you also pay taxes. For rulers are the servants of God, devoting themselves to this very thing. Render to all who is due, tax to whom taxes due, customs to whom custom is due, fear to whom fear, and honor to whom honor. So that there's a lot going on in that passage, but it really keys in on two important points. And if we can keep these in mind during this turbulent time, I think we'll have an easier time with it. The first point is all government authority comes from God. Now, that sounds easy, but we have to accept the fact that, even in the early Christian church period, and any time throughout the times we read in our Bible, that doesn't mean it's necessarily a good government, right? It can be a very evil government, and yet the message is the same. All governmental authority comes from God. When are some times in our Bibles this would have been very difficult for someone who believes in God to accept that reality, that all governmental authority comes from God? What's that? Nero? That's relevant to the Romans. When's another time in the Bible times that would have been difficult? And the judges, okay. The times of the kings, so they were not always following God. Yep, those are on my list too. Pharaoh in Egypt, would that be a difficult time? Yes, very much so. The Babylonian captivity would have been a very difficult time. Just recently in Dan's going through the Bible, he went through Daniel. We might touch on that if we have time a little bit. We can get an idea of how difficult that was at that time. We read about Jesus' interactions in the Gospels with the government authority of that time. I think of Pontius Pilate, right? Did Christ show that he was subject to that authority? Well, he did. So we have that example as well. Paul describes those in government in verses 4 and 6 that they're ministers of God and servants of God, but it doesn't mean that they're necessarily good or evil. It's that God has an effect on who's in authority in a government. Whether that is something that seems to be good or godly or not. We can see that many times that God fulfilled his purposes with evil governments. Can you name some times when God fulfilled his purposes with evil governments? We kind of mentioned some just now, so it's easy to get those. How about with Egypt? What about the situation with the Egyptians and with the Jews being in captivity with Egypt was actually good for the Jews?
God told Pharaoh he raised him up for a time such as that, because his people basically had strayed away, and he raised this evil Pharaoh up to punish his people in order to get them come back.
Yeah, so God raised Pharaoh up in order for the people to be restored back to him. We saw that play out through Moses, but how did the Jews get into Egypt? Through Joseph, right? And Joseph went to Egypt out of this evil act of his brothers throwing him to be captured and turned over. How did that end up benefiting them? He prepared for the famine of the land. In other words, if that evil act hadn't happened, then Israel wouldn't have ended up in Egypt, been protected from the famine, and later they come forth out of Egypt to start with God's people having their own law and their own nation and their own government and so on. So we see this happen all through our Old Testaments, that God uses, in many cases, evil governments for his doing. And so even though we see the government, possible government, as an evil entity in some cases, God can be using it for good. And so we have this admonition in chapter 13 of Romans that we're to be subject to the government because they're there because God put them there, whether they're good or evil. And so on the heels of an election, how does that affect how we should think about it? What does the outcome mean to us? Yes.
Timothy chapter 2, verse 1 and 2.
Mm-hmm.
The Bible tells us to pray for those that are in authority.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I handle it.
Mm-hmm.
I've already prayed to God for the situation that's taking place right now here in America.
Yeah, so that's exactly right. That's one of the verses I mentioned. It's in 1 Timothy chapter 2. And we'll get there, is this idea that we're supposed to pray for those who are in authority. And there's the second part of that, which I think we often overlook. The reality of it is, I think we get too much invested in what happens with the government, especially in a governmental system that we live in, because it is at a level, it's a representative republic, it's a democratic, we have a voice in it, which in human history is an exceedingly rare thing. In fact, throughout all of human history, it's only a very short period of time when that's ever been true. Most world governments are some form of feudalism, where a very few rule the rest of everyone else. It's only in recent times where it's been anything other than that. And so we are kind of challenged in our country, because we do have some abilities as normal citizens that maybe others haven't in human history, to get a little too hung up, I guess you could say, on what the outcome of that government is. Because, like Romans says, all governmental authority comes from God. And in this, passage, the Bible tells us what the value of a government is in those kind of middle verses there, and that is to be an authority on behavior, right? So this idea that if you do good, that things will go well for you. If you don't do good, things will go poorly for you. But even if the government is good and the decisions are bad, we still have an obligation to follow, unless. There is an unless there that is not covered in this passage, and we're going to get to that before class is over. So the second thing towards the end of this reading that we had was another thing that we probably repeat this lesson, about April. Why? Because what happens in April? We pay taxes, right? So we're told, as the second thing we're supposed to do with government is, one, to be subject to it, and the second, to pay taxes. What's the incident with Jesus about paying taxes? Render unto Caesar what is Caesar, and to God what is God's, right? There's a miraculous fish and a coin in the mouth to pay taxes and so on. And so that's the second big obligation. So the first one is challenging depending on what's going on with your government. Sure, there might be different degrees of challenge with it. The second one is always challenging because we're giving up, our income in this case towards that. This morning, we sang a song. The first song that we sang, I thought was really, really good, was "The Church is One Foundation." And it has this line, "Elect from every nation, yet one over all the earth." This idea that the beauty of Christianity is that it can work regardless of the form of government. And any of you who have traveled internationally know that the church thrives whether it's socialism, communism, some type of representative republic, because it doesn't need to. In fact, there is no such thing as a Christian government. There was a Jewish governmental system, but we see time and time again where the Jews wanted a governmental system when they converted to Christianity. How many times did Jesus have to rebuke his disciples saying, "Hey, my kingdom's not from here, so my government is not here. My government is extra worldly," right? So we're citizens of of heaven, not citizens of the United States when it comes to our spiritual lives. So here's this idea that regardless of what happens in our country or whatever country we happen to have been born into or find ourselves in, God can thrive and use us in that situation. So when you look at the United States, I understand and I feel exactly the same way many of you do, that as we're losing things, we're losing ground, we're losing kind of some good things about our country, and those things have really served for good to the world for several things, and we'll touch on that here in just a moment. But we recognize when we look through our Bibles that the outcome for God happens regardless of what happens in government. And the danger of being so concerned about what happens in an election is that we misplace that priority. Because the mission of the church, as was mentioned this morning by Brett, is not that we install a Christian government or Christian leaders. What's the mission of the church? To preach the gospel and convert souls to Christ. God is more concerned about whether we're talking to our neighbors about Christ than whether or not who we vote for in the ballot box, right? Because that's the way it's always worked. If you look at the governmental oppression that happened during the early church and how the church thrived in that, the outcome for God could in some cases be greater even if the outcome politically in whatever place that we find ourselves living on this planet is not. So I think it's just a great reminder. So let's look at a second passage that really kind of says the same thing. It's in 1 Peter chapter 2. 1 Peter chapter 2. And starting in verse 13, although the rest of the chapter would be helpful here, it says, "Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether to kings as to one who is in authority, or to governments as set by him, for the punishment of evildoer and for the praise of those who do right. For such is the will of God, that you by doing right may silence the ignorance of foolish men. Act as free men, but do not use your freedom as a covering for evil, but use it as a bondslave of God. Honor all men, love the brotherhood, fear God, and honor the king." Now, notice again, the thing that's interesting about Peter is perhaps it's even later than some of these other texts, that the church was undergoing severe persecution, and yet the message was be subjected to those authorities and make sure that you're concerned about doing good and not evil. And all these things have a purpose. The purpose of us being subjected to the government is to further the work of Christ. That's what it's really about. So the passage that was mentioned just a minute ago from Timothy, 1 Timothy chapter 2, you want to turn there. Let me put my drink down just a second here. In 1 Timothy chapter 2, it talks about prayer, and I think we understand the importance of prayer and praying for our leaders, but it goes a little further than that, in that it also gives us why that becomes important, why that's important. And I think that's what's often missed. My pages are sticking together. It must be humid out there. So 1 Timothy chapter 2, starting in verse 1. "First of all, then, I urge you that entreaties and prayers and petitions and thanksgiving be made behalf of all men, for kings who are in authority, in order that we may lead a peaceful and quiet life in all godliness and dignity. So that second verse, and I don't know, my mic's cutting in and out here. Maybe I'm doing something to it here in my pocket. The second verse is, I think, really the key part of this verse that we often overlook. The goal of our prayers for our government is not that we establish some kind of a Christian government, because the reality of it is, and this may seem like a controversial statement, is there is no such thing as a Christian government. Well, how can I say that? Well, if there was supposed to be a Christian government, wouldn't Jesus have established it in the first century? No, of course he didn't. He was preaching against that. There are Christians in a country, and there can be Christians who work as civil servants in a country. And yes, it is nice if our people in positions of leadership have a Christian perspective. Certainly that's all true and can be something that's desired. But the verse here is talking about that we're able to continue the work of the church. And so by putting that in perspective, regardless of outcomes, the concern is not how it affects us in terms of what it's like to live in a country. The concern is really that God's work continues. And that really becomes more clear in verses 3 and 4 of 1 Timothy chapter 2. This is good and acceptable in the sight of God our Savior, who desires all men to be saved and come to a knowledge of the truth. So, again, it's emphasizing this idea that we pray for our leaders that the gospel can continue. So when you think about our country in really last 250 years or so, although we were founded by a lot of people who had a very deep belief in God and established a form of government that has a lot of the things that if we said this is the right way to do it, this is what we would like to have, and we'd like to see that remain in place. But as we look through the course of human history, know that governments come and go. I think Dan said that recently. But God's purposes don't change. And if you think about what good has come from this country, it relates to what Brett put up on the board today and what we're going to talk about tonight. In the world we live in today, how has the government of the United States benefited the world? The U.S. has become the most prolific in support of missionary efforts around the world. It's been true for a couple hundred years. This congregation is very much engaged in that. We at the end of the year we have a giving, and a lot of our budget goes to missionary efforts, which, when you think about it, we can know for sure that living under the governmental system we have seems to have benefited that way. But there may come a day, and I've heard this from missionaries as well, where missionaries from other countries will send missionaries to the U.S. Yeah, it may have already be happening. And so we can see, the benefits of that. So because of all these government authority comes from God, we are to live into subjection into it. The reason being we want it to continue the gospel, but that's also the reason why we're supposed to follow the law. It's not about overtaking governments. That's not what the Bible tells us to do. If that were true, it would have been true in the first century. There's a common phrase, I think there's a lot of truth to it, that the church can be in any country. It can be kind of the conscience of the country through what means? Through preaching the truth, teaching the gospel, being good citizens, setting good examples. The consequences of criminal behavior are always bad, brought on by our government, but there isn't a consequence for living right. Now that's where there's kind of that exception, and we only have about 6 minutes left. And that kind of exception comes from, what if there's a case where the government asks me to do something that goes against the will of God? well, clearly then we're going to have a problem. Daniel is a great study on this topic. There's a few instances where Daniel and people associated with him were asked to do something that they wouldn't do. So clearly at the beginning of Daniel, and I'll just use the names that were later used, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Remember, they were thrown into the fire furnace. One of the things that they did is they wouldn't eat the king's food because it violated their laws as Jews. And so they resisted that because God asked them not to eat those things. And then with the Daniel instance, what was he? It's a famous story, we know it as our children, but from childhood, he was in trouble for praying to God, right? 3 times a day. And what happened to him? He was thrown into the lion's den. In both those cases, God delivered those people. But I think what's interesting is, and the same is true about Joseph, is that Daniel became a really important figure in this secular government and became respected in this secular government. Not because he tried to overthrow the government, but because he subjected himself to it. And through that subjection, God was praised. So Nebuchadnezzar praised God because of that pattern. The same thing was true with Joseph, right? What happened to Joseph? He was accused by Potiphar's wife and was thrown into prison, and later, through being able to interpret Pharaoh's dreams, he gets this position of authority. Did he break out of prison? No. Did he lead a revolt or rebellion? No, he didn't do that. So that's the pattern that we find. If you come to the New Testament, we see over and over again instances where people submitting themselves to the governmental authorities actually led to the furtherance of the gospel. Paul and Silas were in prison, right? And when the chains came off and the doors opened, what did they do? They sat there and they sang. And what happened because of that? The Philippian jailer was converted and his whole family. Because why didn't they leave? They had this free pass, this exit plan, this exit strategy. Why didn't they just get up and leave? Because they had been arrested. So they were subjecting themselves to those rules, because that's what we're called to do as Christians. And so, just with a few minutes left here, I think it is really easy for us to get really wrapped up into politics and the things that happen in our country. Who knows what the outcomes are going to be? The world has been becoming a crazier place. There's conflict in the world. There's wars going on right now. It's hard to know. But the beauty of following these 2 simple rules of paying taxes and being subject to the government and letting God take the rest of it, that's where we can find peace. And that's what we're called to do as Christians, with the idea in mind that if I can have peace, I can focus on what God really wants me to focus on. Instead of being so engaged politically, spend that same time talking to your neighbor. Get involved in the mission work here, because that's what God really wants us to do. Now, I'm not saying that you can't be engaged in politics, or it's like was said this morning. The problem is if it becomes a priority. If somehow influencing government seems to be our priority, that's when we tend to get in trouble. So one other thing on this tax thing that I think is kind of a new kind of event. Have you heard about this tax someone's been throwing out there? I'm not going to say what it is, but someone knows what it is. That there's a big tax that they might put out there. It affects a lot of people. It's been thrown out there. Unrealized gain. Have you heard of that? Yes. Now that makes me think I want to go march in Washington. I don't know about you. That would actually happen. That's a huge radical change, and it destroys this idea of Americans being able to have the American dream and our kids being able to have all these things. But if I look at it, now I think there's some things you can do within the law to try to fight some of these things. But if I look at that idea that something like that might happen, and I look at Romans 13, what should my reaction be? Yes, Ron.
You know, I studied this over a couple of times. The one that bothers me the most is the Civil War.
Mm.
David Lipscomb went to the president of the Confederacy and told him that he did not believe in a physical fighting. So the Church of Christ was the only group to get conscientious objector status in the Civil War. Second, we had people on both sides of the conflict praying that God would kill the other side. So here you got a godly man in Alabama, or we can say Tennessee, and a godly man in Ohio. They're sitting there praying that God would kill the Christians. I'm not sure they use that word.
Right.
The enemy, whoever the enemy was. So we need to be very careful when we pray.
Mm.
But as you said, the Bible says the leaders, it doesn't say the leaders we like, the leaders we voted for. So we just need to be very careful, because this is all in God's hands. And we won't know the answer for possibly hundreds of years.
Yeah, Ron, because people can't hear necessarily, was saying that this becomes very difficult because if you look at history and look at things like the Civil War, we had people on opposing sides praying for harm to the other side, and this isn't really good or healthy as a Christian. And I would second that from the standpoint of, you know, while we have enjoyed what we have in this country, you know, we started this country, or this country was started rejecting some of the principles of Romans 13, of going against authority and so on. But a lot of that stuff is history and is not an endorsement of it, because as Christians, what we do to get our minds correct and think about what God really wants is we always come back to the Word. And, you know, in my mind, as I unfortunately am inundated like you, because I listen to the news for economic reasons and things like that with all this, it gets my blood pressure going, you know, to think about all the changes that are being proposed that I would not agree with. But if I step back and say, this is in God's hands, what the outcome, God will use whatever it is. And that's really what it's benefited me to study it. Hopefully this morning it's helpful to you to just to kind of bring it back in and huddle in and say, look, this is in God's hands, whatever happens, and who knows what's going to happen. I don't know what's going to happen. Nobody knows. But thank you for your time. We're out of time. I don't know who. I think Dan would be back next week. So